What is up, fellow Endless? Welcome to my The Sandman episode 11 breakdown, recap, and review, but also quite an ending slash backstory explained, especially with the second part, which was titled Calliope, and how it ended with the reference to Orpheus. So we will be getting into an overall review, don't get me wrong, and a breakdown, but there will be some spoiler-esque sections where I compare stuff to the comic books. There's also Easter eggs that we're going to get into with regards to Orpheus Dream, if you will, and Calliope. Maybe some of you didn't even know. You're like, who's Orpheus? He has a son, and how there's even references to that in previous episodes that you've already seen, but also diving into what the future could hold with this character when looking at the source material. But again, spoiler warnings will be given. There's video chapters here if you just want to skip the first story and go straight into my breakdown of the Calliope story, because that's the most I've got to say stuff about. First of all, I just want to say I'm really happy that we got this bonus episode of The Sandman. It's adapting two stories from the third volume titled Dream Country. So let's first start off, of course, with A Dream of a Thousand Cats. I thought that this was just adapted so well, and I loved the choice of animation in this episode, because obviously when you're doing a self-contained story for The Sandman, of which we know, Sandman has quite a lot of these stories throughout the overall story, and where Orpheus Dream himself isn't always leaned on as heavily as he is in other episodes. But for this one, with A Dream of a Thousand Cats, it's just like, how would you adapt a story about a young kitten going to a gathering of cats to hear this, prophet cat that you've heard about, preaching about how cats once took over and ruled, well, not took over, but they just ruled the world. How many times did I say cats there? Well, one way of doing that would and is animation. And I thought that the animation was beautiful and really well made. And obviously doing CGI within that of a real world would present, other challenges, and it could look really, really good. Don't get me wrong, but I actually much prefer this. And that's just because this gave The Sandman the opportunity to produce its own animated story in an episode, of which I felt really fit the mold of The Sandman very well, because it didn't feel like it didn't belong in The Sandman being an animation. But in a world that consists of endless and dreaming, it feels as though after seeing this, I would be down for seeing loads and loads more bonus stories that are housed in animation. And of course, since all of this was an animation, it was done by voiceover, and we got to have some very special cast members for characters in this episode, of which I'm sure many of you recognize, such as James McAvoy, who played Orpheus Dream in the Audible series. He was the guy, the human prophet, if you will, who told all the other humans, hey, we're tiny, but if we dream, we can rule this world and get rid of the huge cats and they become tiny. We also have Michael Sheen, who played Lucifer in the Audible series, playing a guy just as freaking sinister. I don't really want to talk about what he did with those freaking kittens. I think that's all I need to say about Michael Sheen. Damn you. Then we had David Tennant. How could you not recognize his voice? He kind of played a smaller role. I think his name was Don. He was part of that married couple who owned the kitten, of which, went along and went to this whole cat preaching prophet storytelling time. And that little kitten as well was played by Rosie Day, and guided by the Grey Cat, played by David Jassy. But we also have the creator himself, Neil Gaiman, play a role, and that was the crow in the heart of the dreaming, of whom directs Sandra Oh's prophet Siamese cat to the Cat King, which is of course Dream himself, just in cat mode. And if you were a fan of certain little cameo voice roles in this episode, you'll be happy to know that Neil Gaiman said to Entertainment Weekly that I'd been working with David Tennant and Michael Sheen on Good Omens anyway, so that was a no-brainer. They're both in The Sandman because they love The Sandman. The main thing was that we had to promise both of them that if they lent their voices to this, it didn't mean that they couldn't come back and actually be in the Sandman TV show later. This wasn't their one chance. They both needed to be reassured of that. So that makes me very, very happy because, James McAvoy, David Tennant, Michael Sheen, they're all fantastic actors, and, the idea, and the other cast in this first part of the story to this two-parter episode. I love the idea that we could see David Tennant and Michael Sheen in some future episode and some adaptation in the live-action side of things. So if you're a long-time Sandman fan, let me know who you would have David Tennant play and any other role that was featured in A Dream of a Thousand Cats. Do you have any particular Sandman issue or story in mind? Let me know down in the comment comments below, because we could very well be getting it. Now, I may sound like a bit of a broken record here if you've watched my previous Sandman review, just going over the whole series in general. It's just that this episode, again, adapting A Dream of a Thousand Cats, just was so faithfully adapted. But the funny thing is, if just around 1,000 cats, which, you know, I'm wondering if maybe it would take even more, because, you know, the population back then was probably fewer, so maybe it requires a little adjustment there. It could technically flip back on its side. I mean, in theory, if 1,000 ants dreamed, or maybe more ants, then they could take over the world, but maybe they're not conscious enough to have dreams. I don't know the science of that. Can ants dream? Either way, I liked how the episode ended as well, with David Tennant and his wife in the story just looking at the kitten, just dreaming, and it kind of ends in this snarl and snap. So it reminded me of what we saw in the flashbacks to when cats did own, well, not own, but rule. It was their dominion, if you will, and we saw cats eating humans, so this little kitten was probably imagining the very same thing, maybe even to her owner. But honestly, there's not too much more to say. I mean, I could gush over this for the next half an hour, saying I love the depiction of Dream and talking to the prophet cat and everything like that, but that more or less wraps that self-contained story in this episode. And I've just got so much more to say about the story of Calliope, because there is such bigger repercussions that this story pertains to, of which new audiences have been teased to, with regards to the ending with Orpheus, and, you know, can I come back to the dreaming and we can finally talk about our son and grieve him, and, you know, what's going on there. I'm going to get into some of the backstory in the back half of this video, and then I'm going to explain how Easter eggs are attached in the current series already to Orpheus, but we'll get into that in a little bit from now. But the Calliope episode, oh my god, I really, really liked it. So in that interview with Entertainment Weekly, we had Neil Gaiman talk about this as well, and they detail how it was actually a story inspired by Neil Gaiman's own struggle with writer's block while working on the comic. So Neil Gaiman said, "It came out of writing a story that didn't work. The Sandman issue 17 was meant to be a story called Sex and the Violets, and it was going to be about Puck, grown old, running a brothel of demons," Gaiman explained, referring to the character from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. "But I couldn't get it to work. I was on a deadline, and I realized I had only managed 5 pages in 2.5 weeks. I had a week left to write something, and this was dead on the page. I thought, let's just go into writer's block, let's strip everything down. What's this story going to be about? It's about muse abuse. Okay, I can do that. I wrote it very fast, and it just came into focus." Now, this episode was just brilliant in so many ways. I'm gonna have to try and pace myself here, and there are great additions to the cast as well. We had Arthur Darvill, who played Richard Maddock, the man who struggles with the writer's block, obviously, in this episode, and keeps Calliope prisoner, just as Erasmus Fry did. Now, you may recognize him from a bunch of things, whether you're a DC Legends of Tomorrow fan, he was Rip Hunter on that, to Rory back in the day on Doctor Who. And speaking of Doctor Who, we also had Erasmus Fry, and he was played by Derek Jacobi, of whom was in some of my the favorite time of Doctor Who when I was younger. I believe he played Professor Yana. That's when the Master was returning on David Tennant's run. Oh my god, those were the days. But this episode was just done so effectively as well, because as I keep teasing, not only is it just an intriguing, as yet with Sandman stories, often with some deeper, disturbing nature to them amongst all of this wonder of fantasy and dreaming at the same time, but it contains threads of plot that is crucial, as I kept saying, to the Sandman and the future, right up until how it echoes out to the finish line of the whole of the Sandman. So as we know, many years ago when Erasmus Fry was a young man, he captured Calliope and he kept her prisoner for many, many decades, and he achieved this, as, you know, in the source material, or as very accurately portrayed in this episode, by taking Calliope's scroll, which she laid upon the shore while she was bathing in the sacred springs, and he burned her scroll and he became her master, which effectively made it so she was bound to him and could never be free unless he literally granted it and spoke the words. Now, as we know, she is a goddess, the youngest of the 9 muses of Greek mythology, and just the very disturbing thing about this story is what Calliope has to endure, obviously. And when men such as Erasmus and Richard Maddock, and what they're willing to do to achieve things as trivial as getting ideas. Now, the episode obviously didn't go into explicit detail about the suffering of Calliope, but they're very obviously hinted. Now, as we know, Calliope is abused, and the type of abuse to achieve inspiration from the muse Calliope is what you can imagine, and as Erasmus said, I found force to be most efficacious. Now, the director Louise Hopper said, I'm not crazy about directing sex scenes in general, let alone horrific ones. For me, it's about the emotion of the scene, and you understand the implication of that. It's all about that shot going down to his computer, because that's the ego, that's the ambition, that's his insatiable thing he wants. We're not shying away from it, we're adults. We know what this is, we don't need to see it in this particular instance. And that's the messed up thing, because when we visit Richard Maddock, or Rick Maddock if you will, he's kind of unsure about it at the beginning, doubting it. He seems uncomfortable, saying that he's not sure he can do this. But as soon as that pressure comes from his agent saying, they're going to take back their advance payment if you don't produce anything, we see him go upstairs, and he returns downstairs flooding his Word document or whatever with so many words, with evident scratches around here on his face, signifying the horrific act he's done to achieve this inspiration, if you will. Now again, compared to the graphic novel, it's adapted extremely well, and very often from panel to panel, shot to shot, down to the very words from the pages literally being pasted into the actors' mouths. In the comics, I would say Erasmus looks much creepier, and when Richard Maddock is showing Calliope, she is completely naked in that room. It's kind of a much more harsher light shone on it in the comic book pages compared to that of what they're going to bring to screen. Don't get me wrong, I felt the disturbing aspects of this episode, but for obvious reasons, they don't go into the extra mile. But as I said, even though this was adapted very accurately, when you read the story, it's just got even more of like a raw format there for what Calliope has to endure. Another example would be when Richard Maddock is somewhat trying to find some justification in his head for what he's doing. We get that little flash of Erasmus saying, oh, don't worry, she's not human or anything like that. That's all the same in the comic, to the point of where he's reminding himself of that she's not human and trying to make it seem like what he's doing isn't messed up, when let's just say he's doing a thing and taking the inspiration from Calliope. And for obvious reasons, I can't show those comic book panels on screen, but it is just, that's what this guy did in this episode. But then there's, the examples of accuracy as well, with the three, obviously the kindly ones that you should all recognize from the series so far, and they tell her that she is lawfully bound due to being snared upon Helicon according to the mystery, so they just can't help her. It's, especially the kindly ones, they uphold sacred rules, so they can't, break them, especially when it's according to the mysteries. In this conversation, as you know, they mention the Endless and how they haven't been having a great time recently. Orpheus, of course, and how they didn't part on the best of terms. So we're going to get into some of that backstory, don't worry. That's more of the less spoilery stuff from the source material that I'm sure some of you will listen to a little bit later on. They say, but she did indeed bear his cub. And I'm sure some of you were just like, wait, what? Dream has a kid? And that's way back when Dream was her husband and he was going by the name of Aneros. And another bit of bonus info here for those who are also fans of the comics and, hoping to see stuff like this more and more in the future. Alan Heinberg told Entertainment Weekly, I had the benefit of having Neil's entire Orpheus saga in my head, and knowing that we have every intention of adapting it if we're allowed to, being able to work on this story, knowing where we're going with it and what their trauma was as a couple and as parents, it allowed us to write those scenes with as much grief and depth as possible. This is a side of Morpheus that doesn't show up anywhere else in our season. The nice thing about casting Melisanthe and the chemistry they have is you believe they were together and that they loved each other and still do. You believe they were the parents of this child. That was surprising to me, how much power those scenes had. Now, for those interested, we will get into more of the details of Orpheus in a moment. But as I was saying, there is an Easter egg in this scene with the kindly ones in the background that pertains to Orpheus that I will get into a bit more context with, because I can't really say the Easter egg without kind of talking about Orpheus. But all I will say is that, the kind of backdrop location that appears when they're there has very much so to do with Orpheus, and how it also all ties back to the Easter egg from that conversation with Dream and Hob Gadling talking about Lady Johanna Constantine and the task that she went on for him and succeeded admirably, he might add. that's all a part of the same thing. What I found so effective as well, and what Sandman does so effectively time and time again, is that this was another Sandman episode that mirrors the profound ability the comics also has, and that is the ability to keep the reader or, viewer of the series engaged, even when Morpheus himself isn't all that involved. I mean, as we know, that within the Sandman, and as new viewers may have been able to tell through certain episodes, like A Dream of a Thousand Cats, or even this one, Dream doesn't and isn't always heavily leaned on in certain stories. So as a result, in this story, Tom Sturridge's Dream only appears towards the end of this 1 hour-ish plus episode. And it just kind of adds this extra layer of gravity to when he is in, the story at the end with Calliope. I also think that Melisanthe Mahut did such a fantastic job as Calliope. I really want to see her again, and I think we most definitely will, especially with the story of Orpheus that they most certainly will adapt in the future, which is something I'm going to rave about later when we get into the detail and the journey and the tragedy of what happens with Orpheus and his life, and, to what his parents and how much they're involved with it. That episode is just going to be freaking great, and I'm sure many of you know what I'm on about. And when Dream gets out of the imprisonment and goes to her, the chemistry was fantastic. You can tell that Dream feels so deeply about her still, and that they were so very much in love, with even added lines compared to that of, or verses that of the comic book, such as, "When I heard you call to me, even after all this time." And he couldn't quite say, he says, "Let me help you." So clearly and evidently, there's a lot of feelings there still for Dream. And that specifically isn't said in the comic, and that's exactly what I'm on about. I like how much this show adds depth, and way more depth, to Dream's feeling in this episode, or other episodes such as what I talked about in my series review, the 24-Hour Diner with Dr. Destiny / John D. In that story, without going over and repeating myself too much, he is just doing it for a bit more of a sadistic point of view, and he likes driving the world mad. Here, with David Thewlis's John D, there's just a lot more. It's a warped humanity to him, but you know what I'm talking about. There's a lot more depth to Dr. Destiny's madness from that of Dream's Ruby. And the same even with this story, although it still was adapted extremely accurately. Don't get me wrong, in the comic, he appears to Calliope in a similar way, and she requests him to make him let me go. And so we see some similar lines of Dream talk to Rick Maddox saying, hold your tongue, and, talk about the human agency. But the way Tom Sturridge here is literally on the edge of obliterating him, but only doesn't because of Calliope's request. The emotion behind Dream radiates through Tom Sturridge's performance here. He wants to do so much more. As he says, he must be punished, but she doesn't really let him go that far. Calliope replies with saying he's nothing, he's just a man. Even his death would not bring back what he has taken from me. Ultimately, and obviously enough, Dream is disgusted by Richard Maddox for demeaning and abusing Calliope, not to mention in how he can relate, in a sense, just in a sense of in how he was imprisoned for 100 years under Roderick Burgess, but also, as we hear him say, his suffering was nothing compared to hers. And lines like that are innovation compared to that of the, lines in the comic that is what I'm exactly on about. It's a lot more effective in this series that, I feel like improves upon the work, which is why I enjoy what Neil Gaiman said so much in tackling his own story many decades later. He said something, and I'm abbreviating here, but along the lines of what would he do if he were to revisit this story now? Perhaps he would not obviously deviate or change things massively, but innovate and improve upon it. It's something of what I would describe as gilding it, kind of gold plating an already existing pretty thing. And then with the latter of the episode, the same aspects of the story unfold very similar to the comic book, and where Richard was given an abundance of ideas that kind of overwhelm his mind and start to make him go crazy a little bit. So many ideas come to him so fast and come out in very disturbing ways. One thing that was very accurate to the comic was his bloody fingertips where he was writing the ideas. In the comic, it got to the point of where he's scratching at his face as if it was, to symbolize he's trying to just stop these ideas from inside his consciousness, and he's trying to claw at it, so to speak. And for me, I'm just so grateful about that and this episode, because we did see, with what the showrunner said earlier, we haven't seen that side of Dream before in this series so far? It's like, yes, but no, like we saw him with Nada and he changed his form and he had very teary eyes, when he saw her in A Hope in Hell in episode 4. But yeah, this is like a even more layered, in-depth connection that he has with Calliope. They share a tragedy and things like that. Now, this is where things get interesting, and we're no spoiler warning yet, but just before we get to that part, the ending and the departure between both Dream and Calliope, we have the moment in the comic version in where Calliope asks, maybe I could visit you in the dream realm. It would be nice to see you again properly. What do you think? And Dream replies saying, I do not think that would be a good idea, Calliope. But in the show, the line goes, may I visit you in the dream realm sometime so that we can finally talk about our son and grieve him properly. Which is, okay, well, grieve him. They didn't say that in the comic, and which again plants another seed for Orpheus. But yet also puts into question, I guess, what is happening with Orpheus in this adaptation. But I do have an explanation for that. I don't think they've deviated at all. It's just I've got a theory with what they might be adding to it slightly that I would love existing fans who have read the material's thoughts on down in the comments, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, as the kindly one said in this episode to Calliope, that boy child who went to Hades for his lady love and died in Thrace, torn apart for his sacrilege, he had a beautiful voice too. Orpheus. So now let's get into the lessery kind of spoilery stuff from the source material, and that is Orpheus's backstory. If you're curious as to who Orpheus is, what the comic book backstory is for his character, Dream and Calliope's son, what happened, why grieve and things like that, or whatever's going on there, well, we're about to enter that period, so a little bit of a spoiler warning there. Again, it's not the as spoilery stuff, but it is most likely what will be adapted in a self-contained, well, it's not really self-contained, well, maybe it will be, episode following what exactly happened there. And it most definitely will be visited upon at some point, because it's very crucial, as I said, to the repercussions of the plot towards the finish line for The Sandman. Right, spoiler stuff. Ding! We're now going into spoiler territory. So as the kindly ones say here, Calliope and Dream's son went to plead with Hades in the Greek underworld to return his wife to him. And this is because on the day of Orpheus and Eurydice's wedding, unfortunately, she died to a snake bite. And after this, obviously Orpheus was devastated. He had appealed to his father, who went by the name, well, it was Dream, but like he went by the name of Oneirus. As we hear Calliope say in this episode, she just refers to him as Oneirus, to maybe plead his case in front of Hades on his behalf, saying, if maybe you sent the Dream Lord to Hades, he would listen, right? But Dream refused. And, imagine, your dad is someone that powerful and maybe could have quite an impact, but just says no. And that refusal from Dream causes issues, of which we're about to get into in a minute. But after that, he actually goes to Dream's big sister, Death, to try and appeal to her. But she says something typical of Death, obviously, saying it was her time to go. People die, it's okay, it happens, which kind of sounds a bit patronizing, but probably delivered in a very soft Kirby Hal Baptiste encouraging and supportive way, and to ultimately go on in his life. But obviously, Orpheus, he can't go on without her. And Death continues to say that she wishes that she could help Orpheus, but she's not hers anymore. She's in the underworld, and that's where you people go. She's in Hades' realm. But Orpheus continues to plead with her to the point of where she somewhat does agree to help him, and that's through telling him the location of where the gate to the underworld is, where Hades resides. And the thing is, as you may know with the story, the traditional story of Orpheus anyway, he goes into the underworld, and Hades does indeed agree, after Orpheus sings a little song and whatnot, to return Eurydice to the waking world, to be resurrected under a certain condition. And that is, as you may know already, that he is not to look back on his entire journey that will take hours and hours and hours, throughout the underworld until he sees the light of day. He's not allowed to look back once. Not once, but that Eurydice will be following Orpheus as if it was his own shadow, right? So he had to resist that temptation the whole time, and as he walked out initially, he was like, okay, well, cool, but he heard Hades and his other half cackling with laughter, which set a little bit of doubt in his mind. And so he did just that. He spent many hours walking to the point of where, you can't leave the underworld the same way you come in. So there's this other way where to stick to a path, and there's basically a little kind of tunnel of light, which, once you reach past that, you're out into the waking world. And as he was right at the frickin' end of it, he thinks that perhaps Hades is deceiving him, that he's the butt of Hades' joke. He remembers the laughter, and he thinks that perhaps Eurydice isn't behind him, and that he's just journeying alone. And so he looks back, and that is the last time he ever sees his wife Eurydice again. It's kind of that look back, and she's like, my love, and she's like kind of falling back like that. And you can only imagine, like, if he had just gone and carried on, and, he did get a glimpse of her, but she faded back into the underworld. And he was absolutely devastated after this, as you can only imagine. He didn't really have the will to live anymore. He wanted to end his life and things like that, but he can't really die as easy as, like, your general normie human, because he is the son of a goddess and one of the endless. So, there's that, which comes into a massive part of this story. But as to why Calliope left Dream, because that's something we need to address, and as to why Dream hates Calliope but no longer does. Well, after the whole thing with Orpheus, coming back from the underworld, Dream and Calliope had quite the argument, and they argued about the fact that Calliope says to Dream that he should have talked to the gods of the underworld for Orpheus, as they respect him, and she goes on to say sometimes she thinks they even fear him. But no, he didn't do that. And so she recaps this to her son and says, so I walked out on him and told him that she would see him no longer. And she wasn't sure if she loved him after this, even saying that it's been coming for a long time, going on to even say that he cannot share anything, any part of himself, and that she thought she could change him. Once again, reminding me of how, even though Dream is a little bit different in present day, we saw how cold he was with Hobgadling, as I mentioned earlier. Imagine what he was like all this time ago with Calliope. But this is when, in that conversation between Orpheus and his mother Calliope, that she warns him that the Bacchanti are coming and that they are dangerous and the sisters of frenzy. And he's like, well, I don't care about the Bacchanti. And after they arrived, they offered him and basically told him to join in on their worship, talking about how they are the beloved of Dionysus. And he refused, because what they wanted him to get involved in with their rituals and their worship was some, again, I can't show the comic book panel because it's some messed up stuff. So no wonder Orpheus refused. But because he refused, they ripped him apart, and he basically amounted to this disembodied head. Still alive, but, like, they tossed his head into a stream, and eventually Dream found him. That is just no way to live. So on top of, like, losing his wife, he's now a disembodied head. He wants to die anyway, and now he's in an even worse position. But it kind of gets worse. So after his father Dream finds his son Orpheus, he comes to tell him goodbye, and that he visited some priests in their dream on this island called Naxos. I might butcher that pronunciation. And he made it so that they would find him and take care of him. But Dream said that he would not see Orpheus again. And he begs his father to help him die, but Dream refuses, which technically is understandable in a manner of speaking, because, again, as we know, the reason why it would have been so bad for Dream to kill Rose Walker in the finale of season 1 is because that was one big plot from Desire to make Dream kill one of the Endless, because Rose Walker is technically, as Dream said, a child of the Endless, and that is a big part of the rules, the rules that these larger entities abide by, and that the kindly ones, basically enforce. So you could argue that Dream didn't want to do it for that reason, but of course he also deeply does care about his son. But in this moment, as he walked away down the kind of shoreline, he didn't even look back, even if he wanted to. Eventually, though, as he stayed on the island with the priest watching over him generation after generation, he was eventually stolen. Now, Andros is a character on that island of whose family had been generation after generation, as I said, looking after Orpheus. And he says to his son in issue 41 of The Sandman that he was pretty annoyed at his grandson because, he was too visible on guard, and to tell him that they stole our charge 200 years ago, and it was 30 years before he was returned to us. And, that was referring to Orpheus being stolen. It's taken 30 years for them to get back. So this is where it cuts into the connection of episode 6, The Sound of Her Wings, with Hobgadling and that conversation I was on about, because in 1794, a few years after the 1789 meeting with Johanna Constantine, confronting Hobgadling and Morpheus, thinking that he was the devil and whatnot. Well, Dream met her a few years later, and in 1794, in Paris, France, during the French Revolution, Lady Constantine, in issue 29 of The Sandman, was doing that task, of which Dream said, I met her again, Johanna Constantine, and she succeeded admirably at the task. And that task was none other than to retrieve Orpheus's head. And you may wonder why Dream didn't do it himself. It's because he couldn't be directly involved in that family affair, but he offered a reward to Lady Johanna Constantine in that he would give her what it is in his power to give her. And Johanna Constantine, being the person she is, was like, okay, yeah, I'll do that, get some power from the Endless. And Lady Johanna had quite a difficult time getting Orpheus out of Paris at the time, but she did succeed and returned him to that island called Naxos with the priests, and he was chilling there. And a nice bonus piece of information is eventually later on, when Lady Johanna died, she was put to rest there. There's actually a gravestone there marking her name, and she was forevermore there. And I believe even flowers grew where her grave was, near Orpheus, where he was residing in the little dome. So that's just nice to know. But speaking of that dome, finally, let's get back to the Kindly Ones scene in episode 11 with Calliope. So when the Kindly Ones enter, they have that little kind of backdrop, as I was saying. And in the background is that somewhat dome-esque structure on that island, and that island is none other than the island where the priests are looking after Orpheus, and he is within that kind of little structure in the background, which is just like a detail I really appreciated. Also, technically, by this time, easily Lady Johanna Constantine's gravestone would be there as well. Now, the thing that intrigued me, and I want to get some of your thoughts about here, is the line that was changed at the end that I went over earlier, where Calliope says to Dream, "May I visit you in the dream realm sometime, so that we might finally talk about our son and grieve him properly." There's a few ways to look at this. So I'm sure that the show did it for new audiences to think, their son is dead, for later on it to be revealed to the audience that, oh no, Dream actually organized his disembodied head to be chilling on this island with priests. That's one possibility. But another one is, I suppose, that maybe in this iteration and adaptation on Netflix, Dream never told Calliope that after he was torn apart that he had continued to live. And maybe we're going to get a scene where in the present day he brings Calliope and we'll see her once again visiting their son's head. But obviously that would be kind of a heartwarming scene, but also she might be mad at him. Which is interesting because in the comics, Calliope does visit Orpheus from time to time. So, yeah, it's just, I may be reading too into it. It's interesting in how she said, so that we might finally talk about our son and grieve him properly. So maybe the last option is that she was saying in a roundabout way, knowing that he's still alive, but grieve the existence that he once had, I guess, because at the end of the day, he's just chilling on an island and he's not living like a normal kind of life. So you can kind of grieve, but I don't know. I'd love to know old-time fans' opinions on that. But either way, especially with how crucial Orpheus is to like the long-standing aspect of the Sandman, he's obviously still there. He's there on that island, and I'm sure you will now see how amazingly beautiful and tragic that episode will be when we get that. Like, imagine with the Sandman's budget and everything, exploring the underworld, seeing Hades, seeing Orpheus go there, seeing him look behind. That's going to be a very, very good episode. I can just see it now, and I want it very badly, very badly. And I guess that kind of marks the end of this video. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. It's another long, in-depth deep dive into a lot of different things. I'm looking forward to even just seeing the backstory stuff behind Orpheus, and as I said earlier, seeing an episode where he goes to Hades is going to be epic but tragic for not getting his wife back, but also we can get Jenna Coleman's lady, Johanna Constantine, back in terms of searching for Orpheus's head. And all kinds of other things. There's lots of stuff ahead, seeing Calliope again. Let me know first and foremost what you thought of the adaptation of A Dream of a Thousand Cats and Calliope, but what do you think if you're brand new to this and you stuck around for the backstory, and do you think they might change it in this adaptation a little bit? I mean, we know for sure that Lady Johanna Constantine went and did that task for Dream back in 1794, so in that episode of Orpheus, I'm sure it's going to be like a similar thing to The Sound of Her Wings, where we had The Sound of Her Wings beginning part and then the hog gaddling part at the end. We're probably going to have the Hades part at the beginning with Orpheus, the wedding, the snake bite, all of that, and then in the back half, the rescue, the island with the priests. But I need to shut up now. Been going on for far too long. Thank you so much for watching. Going to be doing more Sandman videos, so do subscribe, covering news and everything with regards to future seasons and whatnot. If you enjoyed this video and you got this far, please show your support by liking the video. It helps me spread out there a bit more in the algorithm, gets new Sandman fans here so we can talk about all of this great stuff together. Follow me on social media down in the links below in the description box. But I'm gonna love you and leave you now, guys, so thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you fellow Endless in the next video. Goodbye.